I'm taking the BackupAssist ER Challenge, and today it's time for a Cloud Virtual Machine Disaster Recovery, or VMDR. You'll want to do this if your local offices have been completely wiped out, including your backup device as well as the original source machine. So your only option is to recover in the cloud. This is a little more involved because we have to provision cloud servers in order to do the recovery and then to run the machine as a HyperV guest. But I'm up for a challenge, so let's do it. So the first step in the virtual machine disaster recovery process is to spin up a VM in the cloud and download the backup. So I'm logged into my Microsoft Azure account, and I'll create a new virtual machine in the cloud. And what I'll do is I'll call this the VMDR download. Now I'm going to choose the region, the same region where my data is, and I will choose Server 2019. In terms of the size, for the purposes of this demo, and I think also good practice, we want to use a very powerful machine when downloading the backup. I'll explain why a bit later while the machine is provisioning. We'll set a password. And for network security, I'll just use the defaults. Obviously, in a real-life environment, you'd want to do better. Now, in terms of the SSD, what we need to do is to create an SSD. This is an additional disk to be connected to the machine that's going to be amply big enough to host the backup. Now, if you remember, my original Surface was 128 gig, and the backup of that was about 50 gig. So I'm going to choose 256 because that's going to be ample. Networking, it's again, for the purposes of this demo, I will just use the defaults. Management, again, I'll just be using the defaults. And advanced. This is, again, is okay because all we're doing is downloading the backup. So now we can go to review and create. Now I have had problems where after configuring the machine, what gets created isn't actually what I ordered. So I'm just double checking everything here because this GUI is notoriously buggy and sometimes it loses the data disk that I selected. It looks like everything is in order here, so I'll just go ahead and create. Now, while it's deploying, I'll explain why we want to use a more powerful machine. The process of downloading the backup and reassembling it involves uncompressing, unencrypting, and reassembling deduplicated blocks into files and then into the VHDX. As you can imagine, that process can be CPU intensive. And if we don't have a machine powerful enough, the process can be CPU bound. So for the purpose of downloading the backup, I've decided to go ahead with a very powerful machine here. And you could see that there are 64 virtual CPUs. This power is only needed during the download process. So that's why I'm actually going to download that backup to that extra data disk that I created. After the backup is downloaded, I can then shut down the VM and create a less powerful VM to act as the HyperV host. So what that means is that we get the data downloaded to a data disk as fast as possible. The cost of that VM, as you saw, was about just under $10 Australian per hour. And we don't anticipate that this VM is going to be live for more than, well, depending on the size of your data. In my case, I wouldn't anticipate it will take more than an hour to download and reassemble all that data. So the fact that it is the most expensive machine out there kind of doesn't matter because what we're doing is we're getting the recovery done a lot faster than if you use a low-powered machine. So after the backup has been downloaded, it sits on that data disk. We can then detach that disk from the current VM and attach it to the eventual Hyper-V host and then run it from there. So what that means is that you'll be saving money in the long term because we simply don't need a 64 virtual CPU machine to run the Hyper-V guest in the long term. That's excellent. So the deployment has succeeded, and now I can go to the resource. And I have my IP address right here. Now we'll do a few setup tasks. The first task that we need to do is to make sure that the data disk actually got connected. Okay, so we see here that this 256 gigabyte SSD has been created, and we will write to it. I'm going to call it the V drive because this is a virtual machine recovery. So I'll just call that VMDR, and away we go. Excellent. Excellent. So Firefox is now downloaded, and I can download BackupAssist now. Normally you would go to backupassist.com and download from there. However, because this is a pre-release version, I'm downloading from our company's internal file share. So this will obviously not be available once we go live with the software. However, I do have the installer now on my C drive, and I'll install BackupAssist ER. And while we're at it, we'll also shut down other applications that are no longer needed. Okay, now let's go ahead with the install. All done. So now we can actually start what it is we wanted to do, which is to connect to our cloud backup that we performed some time ago, and then download that backup to the V drive on this virtual machine. So when we want to recover, generally this tab here shows you the different types of recovery that you can do with handy links to documentation on how to go ahead and do it. In terms of being able to download a cloud backup, the way forward is to click on Available Backups. And we don't have any backups available because obviously this is a fresh install. So what we can do instead is click on this Locate Backup and then choose Microsoft Azure. From there, we can type in the container, which has to match the container setting at the time we did the backup. So I called it Linus ER Challenge. And the connection string comes from Administration Console in Azure. So this is the same connection string that I used when doing the backup. And then, of course, I'm using the same encryption password as well. Now, if any of these don't match, you will not be able to connect to the backup, obviously. It has successfully connected to Azure. It has found the backup. And all I have to do is click on that to select it and then click this button to download it. Now it's going to ask me to confirm where I want to download to. So I'm going to download to the V drive, and everything else can be just at the default setting, and then away we go. So for the purposes of putting this on the time lapse, I will also set up Task Manager so we can actually see what's going on in terms of network and CPU. So we can see that the data is being downloaded at a very good rate. This is within the same Azure data center, and it is bursty. That's to be expected. As we download the data, we download chunks, then we have to reassemble those chunks into actual files and then put that into the backup VHDX. So while this is going, I can set up my Hyper-V host. So let's go back to the Azure console here. And what I'll do is go back to Home and Virtual Machines. And we'll go ahead and create another virtual machine. This is actually going to act as the HyperV host. So once the download has finished, I'm going to shut down the expensive, powerful machine and instead use this less expensive machine. So I'm going to call this the VMDR host. We're going to put it in Australia East, and it's going to need Server 2019, which is fine. Now, I'm going to change the size of it just to, let's say, a D4 general purpose machine. Okay. And we'll go through much the same process as before. Now, while the deployment is going on the way, let's just check in to see how our download is going. Okay, so we've downloaded about 8 gigabytes of data so far, and it's been running for 3 minutes. So let's go back while we wait for this deployment. Excellent, so the deployment is complete. And I can go to the resource, and what I'll do is I'll just copy that IP address. Copy. And what I'm going to do is set up another remote desktop connection to that. While that is happening, we can switch back and see how the download is going. Okay, so the download is running quite happily. And in the meantime, I'm going to configure my VMDR host. So let's log into this new machine now. Okay, now we're in this machine. What we have to do is install the HyperV role on this machine. Okay, we've clicked on HyperV. That's all working well. Now, naturally, when you do a recovery in the real world, you will want to set up networking. Perhaps there'll be a virtual network connection back to your on-premise infrastructure. For the time being, all I'll do is accept the defaults for the purpose of this demo. Excellent. So this feature has now been installed, and all we have to do is to reboot. So what we'll do is we'll restart the machine, and then I'll connect to it a bit later on. In the meantime, we are still downloading, and it looks like we are just around halfway, no, just under halfway through. Excellent. So it looks like the download has completed. We now get a successful message, and we can inspect the report, which indeed shows that the download has fully completed. What I'll do is just quickly navigate to the V drive to verify that the files are there. Okay, so we have a BackupAssist backups directory and the Linus surface backup. And sure enough, we do have our VHDX files stored here. So now this process is complete. I can shut down this virtual machine. Okay, now what we want to do is to detach the V drive from the downloading machine and then attach it to the host machine. So I have to find Let's see, I have to go to virtual machines. Look at my Australia East subscription. Okay, let's open up. So on my downloader machine, what I will do is find a way to detach. Let's see, how do I do that? Okay, it looks like I can't detach it at the moment. Aha! That's probably because I need to delete this machine. So let's go ahead and delete the machine. Okay, status is deleting. And let's see if I can attach this disk. No disks available. Okay, finally the disk appears. It looks like I was trying to do things too fast and I needed to wait for Azure to release that disk. Okay, now that I have saved the configuration, let's just wait for this to update and then I will start the virtual machine. Excellent. Successfully updated, so I will go ahead and start it. So I will start up a remote desktop and log into it. So the first thing we want to do is to make sure that we can see the disk, and indeed we can. Okay, it's mapped to the F drive this time. That's okay. It doesn't really matter what drive letter it's connected as. So now we can move on to step 2 of this VMDR process, which is to make the backup bootable and then to run it in Hyper-V as a guest. So if I go to the F drive, I can see that I have my backups right here, and we see the directory called Instant Boot. That's exactly what we'll want to go into, and here we have an executable called VM Instant Boot. I will run that and just show you this program will convert a backup into a bootable disk that we can then attach to a Hyper-V guest. So the first thing we want to do is to make sure that we can detect the backups, in other words, using this -L option. And sure enough, we can see that it detected this backup that it calls 2-1-1. Now what we want to do is to make that bootable. So I'll do that. Now by default, the backup is purely an image of the hard drive of the original machine. And by default, that backup is not bootable. In order to make it bootable in Hyper-V, there are a few modifications that need to be done on the disk itself. So just call it a bit of magic that we apply to the backup. Now, all changes are actually done to a differencing disk. So we have created, behind the scenes, a differencing VHDX file, and that means that the original backup is preserved. So I can then now use this bootable VHDX file in a Hyper-V guest. So let's go, we don't want to go to accessories, we'll go here, Hyper-V Manager. And let's create a new virtual machine. So I'll just call that VMDR. We want to use a Generation 2 virtual machine because it gives us the UEFI boot feature. And startup memory, I'm going to match the memory that I had on my Surface. Networking, I didn't configure, but we can, obviously in a real life situation, we would want to configure networking properly. And this is the point at which I can connect the VHDX file. So note that this is only about half a gig. This is not the actual backup. It's a differencing disk on top of the backup. So that's done, and we can go ahead and start it. I'll also connect to the machine and we can watch it boot. Now, because we are recovering to dissimilar hardware, that is, we backed up off a Microsoft Surface and we're recovering to a HyperV virtual machine, there may be several reboots as Windows detects new hardware and installs drivers and has to reboot itself. But if everything is working well, we should get to a login screen.
And there we have it. This cloud virtual machine disaster recovery has been a complete success. Challenge complete.